Director Haynes. Let me go for members, and I appreciate it. I know we don't normally do these on Monday. I appreciate everybody coming in. We will be conducting a closed session after this open session, so members should hold any questions on a classified nature until after that. And after the chair and vice chair go through our first round of questions, we'll then recognize members in rounds of 5 minutes, all based on seniority. Director, Haynes, I want to start with where you ended up on 702. This critical component of both law enforcement and the intelligence community expires on April 19th. Congress needs to act. 60% of all the information that goes into the president's daily brief is derived from 702 information, foreigner talking to foreigner in terms of bad guys. One of the things that the Vice Chairman and I are very proud of is we worked very hard on a reform of Section 702 that we introduced last year, including 16 co-sponsors. A great number of members of this committee are part of that reform effort that, again, looked at trying to make sure where there had been perhaps overzealous use at the FBI in terms of who was queried and how things were queried have been dramatically constrained. Director Wray, I want to start my question, though, with you. Some have actually said, though, that where we went didn't go far enough, and they would propose a reform that would require agencies to seek a warrant before conducting U.S. person queries. Could you explain what would happen on a practical level, both from the IC side and the law enforcement side, if that requirement was put in place?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the short answer is that a warrant requirement for us to run U.S. person queries would be untenable and would largely gut the effectiveness of the authority. And I say that for several reasons. First, it would blind us to information already lawfully in our possession that we need to be able to review and act on in a very time-sensitive way to be able to stop terrorist attacks, protect the victim from a cyber attack, warn somebody who is potentially targeted with assassination or kidnapping. Second, in many instances, at the time that the query would be run, we wouldn't have the probable cause that the query term is associated with an agent of a foreign power. That's what the query tells us. And so you got that problem. And then the third problem is that an awful lot of the places that we're using 702 queries are to assist victims and to prevent potential victims from further attacks, whether terrorist attacks, cyber attacks, et cetera. And so in those instances, you'd never be able to get a warrant requirement. Even if there were some kind of delay built into it, that alone, for all these threats, which are extremely time sensitive, I think the DNI correctly used the term agility. That is the key. And so I would implore Congress not to take that additional step. You mentioned the compliance failures. I've been very clear that the compliance failures that occurred at the FBI are wholly unacceptable, and that's why I put in place a whole host of reforms, which are covering everything from training to our systems, approvals, oversight, an Office of Internal Audit. I could go on, and those reforms are working. The FISA court itself most recently found 98% compliance and commented on the reforms working. The most recent Justice Department report found the reforms working, 99% compliance. And so I think legislation that ensures those reforms stay in place, but also preserves the agility and the utility of the tools, what we need to be able to protect the American people.
Well, I appreciate that, and I do think, our reform bill had the notion of trust but verify, so that we would literally legislate the reforms that have been put in place, add a few others, add some of the additional amicus provisions. We also, one of the things I think that have been discovered, that the majority of the queries that involve Americans are actually on victim notification. The very notion of having a warrant to have a victim notification is contradictory in itself. I want to raise another issue that's been, I think that's been appropriately raised, and this is the question around, bulk purchase of personal data. I think we need to go much further on data protection, and I think that has been a failure of this Congress to address in its past. Director Haynes, I know you've done a study on this, and my fear is that some of the proposed reforms would actually not limit foreign entities from obtaining this data, but would limit law enforcement. Can you talk to the question of bulk data purchases and data brokers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think from our perspective, commercially available information, as we sort of think about the entire set of what's out there and what's been discussed in Congress in relation to this, is just increasingly critical to the intelligence community's work. And I think, you know, sort of an obvious example of this is commercial imagery and the role that it played, for example, in the context of the invasion of Ukraine. But there's a whole series of other areas where we're purchasing information, such as commercial threat information that's related to cyber security and things like that. And at the same time, we recognize that commercially available information raises new and important issues related to privacy and civil liberties. And this is in large part true because, you know, more of our daily lives are connected digitally to the world today than ever before. And an increasing amount of data about individuals and their activities, often perceived as not especially sensitive on its own, is actually available for sale alongside increasingly sophisticated analytic tools that essentially, you know, relying on artificial intelligence can actually, in aggregate, raise significant privacy and civil liberties issues that are relevant, which is why we basically said, look, we recognize this is something that is of concern, and we want to make sure that we're actually addressing this issue appropriately and responsibly within the intelligence community. So we had a panel, an external panel, look at this question and really asked them, you know, how and under what circumstances should we use commercially available information, and in particular to reflect on the existing framework for privacy and civil liberties. We've published that report, and in fact, Senator Wyden asked us to, and as a consequence put that out. And as an intelligence community in our XCOM, as we call it, all the heads together, agreed that we thought those recommendations made sense, and we have issued IC guidance basically for cataloging commercially available information acquired by IC elements to ensure that our handling of such information is consistent with relevant legal policy security considerations to facilitate oversight. And we've developed a framework that augments each IC's elements, attorney general guidelines and related policies with general principles and additional guidance on how IC elements should access, collect, process commercially available information, including more precise guidance for identifying and dealing with categories of information that pose a greater risk of implicating privacy and civil liberty concerns. And finally, as the panel recommended also, the framework sets out standards and procedures that govern and require periodic reevaluation and acquisition and use decisions. And I think the challenge that is posed by some of the legislative proposals that I've seen require, for example, again, a sort of probable cause requirement before you can obtain that information. Similarly, we are not going to have in the scenario of, for example, getting cyber threat information commercially, a probable cause reason for getting that. What we're trying to do is understand what the vulnerabilities are, and then what we recognize is that whatever the commercial information is that we're obtaining, we need to treat it in a way that actually mitigates against the risks that have been described.
Thank you. Senator Rubio.
Director Wray, we know that over the last 3 years, millions of people crossed the U.S. border illegally, and many have been released into the country. Have members or people with ties to dangerous gangs, like, for example, the prison gang Tren de Aragua from Venezuela, were they among the people that came into this country?
I don't know that I can speak to the specific gang, but certainly we have had dangerous individuals enter the United States of a variety of sorts.
Are we seeing crimes from people that entered the country over the last 3 years, some of them with ties to gangs or other criminal organizations?
Well, I guess what I would say is this. From an FBI perspective, we are seeing a wide array of very dangerous threats that emanate from the border, and that includes everything from the drug trafficking. The FBI alone seized enough fentanyl in the last 2 years to kill 270 million people. That's just on the fentanyl side. An awful lot of the violent crime in the United States is at the hands of gangs who are themselves involved in the distribution of that fentanyl.
But you're also seeing and tracking local law enforcement arresting and for example, the assault on the police officers in New York, all the reporting said they had ties to this gang in particular. But there's no doubt that people that were criminals in their country of origin have crossed that border and are now in the U.S. committing crimes.
Correct.
Is there now a black market emerging to sell? We've seen reports of a black market emerging selling fake Social Security cards, fake green cards. Have you seen reporting on that?
Well, certainly there is on the darknet, for example, there is a significant marketplace for different kinds of stolen identity.
What about in the street?
I think as well. Yeah.
Okay. And well, there are smuggling networks all over the world that specialize in moving people from all over the world, including from the Middle East, Central Asia, and so forth. Are we aware of any of these smuggling organizations are run by or are conducted by people that have ties, for example, to ISIS or other terrorist organizations?
So I want to be a little bit careful how far I can go in open session, but there, there is a particular network that has where some of the overseas facilitators of the smuggling network have ISIS ties that we're very concerned about, and that we've been spending an enormous amount of effort with our partners investigating. Exactly what that network is up to is something that's, again, the subject of our current investigation.
But there is a network we're concerned about that has facilitators involved in it that have ties to ISIS and other terrorist organizations.
Correct.
I talked about TikTok in the opening. Just to lay the groundwork here, TikTok is this TikTok US, American company or headquartered putatively in America, and they have this platform which is fascinating, right? And people, it's very effective, very good, has a lot of members. One of the things that powers it is that it is powered by an algorithm based on artificial intelligence where the more you use it, the more it learns about you. It, in essence, reads your mind. It knows the kinds of videos you like, and it feeds you more and more of them, causing you to go back. That algorithm is not owned by TikTok. It's owned by ByteDance, a Chinese company, correct?
That's my understanding.
And so the only way that algorithm works is if that Chinese company has access to the data being generated by TikTok. The owner of the algorithm, ByteDance, has to have access. So it doesn't matter where the data is stored. Ultimately, they have to have access to it in order to make the algorithm work, correct?
Right. I mean, I think what you're getting to is the key point is that the parent company is, for all intents and purposes, beholden to the CCP.
Well, the reason why I raise that is if ByteDance in China is the one that owns the driver that makes TikTok effective, isn't it true that under Chinese law, the Chinese Communist Party says that data that you're gaining access to in order to make your algorithm work, we want a copy of that data? If they said that to ByteDance in the future, ByteDance would have to give it to them.
That's my understanding.
And if they went to them and said, we want you to change your algorithm so that Americans start seeing videos that hurt this candidate or help that candidate in the upcoming election, ByteDance would have to do that under Chinese law.
That's my understanding.
And if they said, we want you to put out videos that make Americans fight with each other or spread conspiracy theories and get them at each other's throat, ByteDance can't go to Chinese court and fight the Communist Party. They would have to do it.
That's my understanding, and I would just add that that kind of influence operation, or the different kinds of influence operations you're describing, are extraordinarily difficult to detect, which is part of what makes the national security concerns represented by TikTok so significant.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and my thanks to all of you and, of course, the people you work with every day. I'm going to start with this issue of government purchases of Americans' data. And former acting CIA Director Mike Morell presents something of a different view on this. He has said that the amount of information available for the government to buy would, quote, knock your socks off. And if it were collected through normal intelligence methods, it would be top secret information kept under lock and key. I believe Mr. Morell is right. It is the Wild West out there in terms of sensitive information on Americans, and the government can buy it up. Unlike normal intelligence collection, there are apparently virtually no rules here. To take one public example, I want to go to you, General Cruz, not to be going after you especially, but you said that the Defense Intelligence Agency has acknowledged it obtains and purchases actual U.S. location data. So my question for you and any other members who would like to add to it, are there any constitutional or statutory limits on your agency's purchasing of the location information of Americans? Constitutional or statutory limits, any?
Thank you for the question, Senator Wyden. I would say yes, there are absolute and very clear guidelines for all of us. And when we purchase the bulk data, the first thing we do is we exclude all of the data that is within U.S. territory and is on U.S. citizens as the very first step. Our teams have been here with the Congress talking through our Attorney General guidelines, have been speaking with the concerns that you and others have voiced to us. And I think we have built the processes around our purchasing of commercial data and use of commercial data in
Respectfully,
partnership with you.
I didn't hear you mention what I asked about, either constitutional or statutory limits. So why don't you just send that to us for the record? And I will just say, colleagues, this is the reason why Congress needs to pass legislation limiting government purchases of Americans' information. And I also believe the Congress needs to pass the bill that I introduced with the Vice Chairman, Senator Rubio, making sure this information isn't bought up by foreign countries either. So let's go now to Section 702. And obviously, the government needs to have Section 702 to focus on foreign threats. It is just essential that it be done without throwing aside the privacy rights of law-abiding Americans. There is a workable solution. Under a bipartisan proposal that I've been part of, the government wouldn't need a warrant to run searches on Americans to see who they're talking to. It's only when the government wants to read the content of those private conversations that a warrant would be required, even though there are also many exceptions that we have put into the bill. Exceptions for emergencies, consent, cyber attacks, the list goes on. Now, according to FBI's data, the FBI looks at content in less than 2% of its searches on Americans. So my question would be for you, Director Wray, as I've described it, using your data, the data from the FBI, doesn't our warrant requirement only apply to a tiny fraction of the searches the FBI conducts when you factor in all of these exceptions? I mean, I can go through them, but I think you know them. You know, if there's any imminent danger, no warrant. If there are other dangers, you have to go get the warrant later. But the exception list is very long. So the question is, isn't it correct that what we're talking about in the bipartisan bill here in the Senate and in the House, it would apply to only a small fraction of the searches you're conducting?
Well, while as a percentage, it's not a significant percentage, certainly the number is significant. And I think the fundamental problem with the warrant requirement before you can look at the content is that it's the content that tells us whether or not it's an agent of a foreign power involved. So I think that's part of the problem that we have.
If the witness will pause for a moment.
All other actors have said an immediate and permanent ceasefire will lead to a cessation of any threat. Israel is the biggest threat.
Continue.
I think where I got cut off was I was just explaining that the fundamental problem is that in the instances where we need to look at the content, the probable cause that's lacking at that point is what's established by seeing the content. That's what tells us more often than not that there's an agent of a foreign power involved. And so that's what enables us to then act and go forward with the appropriate investigative steps.
So there's an exception for imminent danger. There's an exception for in other emergencies. There is an exception to simply conversations with foreign threats. I'd like you to send to me, so we'll have this for the record, how having those exceptions will in some way obstruct you when you're trying to deal with a tiny number of warrants. This is all about Americans believing, you bet we have foreign threats. There's no question about it. but we can address those foreign threats in a way that's compatible with the liberty and the values that law-abiding Americans hold. I'm happy to work with you on it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Collins.
Thank you. Director Haynes, you understandably spent considerable time talking about the significant threats that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea pose to our country. Since the way that our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan unfolded, we've also seen a large increase in terrorist attacks conducted by ISIS. In fact, those number nearly 200 and have resulted in some 1,300 casualties. So obviously, Afghanistan has shown that once again, the Taliban is either unwilling or unable to control terrorist groups. Are there threats of terrorist attacks from ISIS toward Americans a problem still? And how are you balancing the great power competition with the threats from ISIS? In addition, I would like you to comment on whether or not terrorist groups backed by Iran, such as Hamas and Hezbollah, pose a threat to our homeland.
Thank you, Senator. So in terms of the threat from ISIS, which you're absolutely right, remains a significant counterterrorism concern for us. Most of the attacks that you're talking about globally taken on by ISIS have actually occurred by parts of ISIS that are outside of Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, there still remains an ISIS concern. It has one where, ironically, the Taliban has actually also concerned about it because the ISIS group that is in Afghanistan is, in fact, going after the Taliban. And so this is a place where actually the Taliban has taken action against that group in ways that are consistent with our also concerns and interests. So that is one piece. In terms of the terrorist groups that are backed by Iran, absolutely, that is a major issue for us. And there are a number of them. Obviously, we often talk about Iranian-aligned militia groups that have been attacking U.S. forces and assets in Iraq and Syria in particular, but also in other parts of the region attempting to. And there have been just dozens and dozens of attacks that we've been looking to manage, and that it continues to be fueled by Iran. They provide weapons, they provide training, they provide money to those groups, and we still obviously see them as a destabilizing force in the region. We also see Iran's support of Hezbollah, as you noted, and of Hamas over the years, and so considerably, not to mention the Houthis is another example of this, but certainly that's been a large issue, and my colleagues may wish to add to this.
Thank you. Director Wray, we know that China is the primary provider of the predecessor chemicals and the pill presses for fentanyl, and you've pointed out in your testimony the extraordinary scope of the amount of fentanyl that has been produced. And indeed, 80% of the overdoses in Maine last year involved fentanyl. But what we're also seeing in Maine is a new phenomenon that was reported by some enterprising journalists, and that is that Chinese nationals are establishing illegal marijuana growing operations all over the state. One public report estimates there are more than 200 of them, primarily in rural Maine. They're unregulated, they're illicit, they're destroying homes because they're growing the marijuana inside, and the marijuana is very potent. What is the FBI doing to support local, county, and state officials? And why do you think the Chinese have sent their citizens to rural America to establish these illegal growing operations?
Well, certainly we're observing the same phenomenon that you're describing. I know we've had a number of cases that have resulted in indictments of Chinese nationals involved with illegal marijuana grow operations here, and otherwise involved in different kinds of organized criminal activity. We are tackling that through working with our state and local law enforcement partners through a variety of task forces. We're trying to share intelligence with them to help get ahead of the threat. I'm not sure that I could give you a reason as to why it's happening, but that is something that we're very focused on. You mentioned the precursors to fentanyl, the pill presses. This issue, I would just add to that yet another one, which is that an awful lot of the meth precursors to the labs in Mexico also come from China. So it's fentanyl, it's also meth. And so there is certainly a big degree to which problems that we are experiencing here in an acute way source back to them.
Senator Heinrich.